Thank you. Thanks very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming to the talk. I'm going to speak about the future, the concept of the future, visions of the future, and the book that I did in the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series called The Future. This is actually my first talk in an academic context. Normally people would give talks, but I do things unconventionally, and not just collaborating with 9 other people to write a single voice book about a single line of Commodore 64 code, but also, in this case, trying to put together a book for a broad audience, for popular readership that engages with what I consider really the essentials of understanding what perspective you can take on the future and how the future is something that people who are compelled, people who are interested, can collaboratively work together to change. It's not a disciplinary book. It grows from my own experiences, however, in digital media, and it does have a certain focus on technology and digital media. So to explain this, actually, a great way to explain it is with reference to an artifact that I found recently after the book was published. I was surprised and pleased to find this portrait of Vannevar Bush. And it's made out of the words of his essay, As We May Think, which was an influential essay. And it was published in 1945 in the initially in the Atlantic, and then in a shorter form in Life magazine. And it had a significant historical influence on the development of the digital media field of hypertext. And it's interesting that this is not the analog computer that Vannevar Bush produced, but that this is what sort of symbolizes his influence at MIT. And I also like that in some very small way, I'm perhaps associated with the influence of this essay because I worked with Noah Wardip-Froon to edit the New Media Reader, which includes As We May Think in it. So our attempting to give a little push, thanks to those who suggested that we include this essay, of course, and those who read it in that collection. This is the plaque that is there at MIT next to this portrait. It describes how Vannevar Bush made a variety of contributions. It was the first dean of engineering, was science advisor, led to his work led to the establishment of the National Science Foundation. And there is, well, one sort of detailed mistake, which is that As We May Think is from 1945 and not from 1946. But there's another problem that I have with this statement, as much as the biography is quite appropriate overall. Vannevar Bush, in his essay, describes a lot of technologies that could come together using things that existed, at least in prototype at the time. And that includes speech recognition, how there were existing and in development technologies that could be used to recognize speech and to make that into part of an information system, and even how Google Glass style head-mounted photography, he imagined, you know, a single sort of cyclopic lens on the forehead, but how you could use that type of photography to enhance research. But these are minor issues compared to the central concept of the Memex, which he talked about in As We May Think. And the central incarnation of the Memex was a piece of furniture, a desk, that would give access to a massive network of research, a global information system. Allowing researchers to create their own trails of association through this network, and allowing those trails to persist so that not only the original documents, but also the ways that researchers interlink them could be communicated. Now, as described, this was not, strictly speaking, a digital computer. in fact, what Bush wrote about as the underlying technology that would be so important to it was microphotography, like, that is used in microfiche types of systems. But Bush's point was to show that it was plausible that there were technologies that could support this type of system. And this type of influence was something that was directly quoted in one of the people I'll speak about later, Douglas Engelbart's project to create an augmentation of human intellect and to create an online system that allowed this type of hypertextual linking. So as wonderful as it was to see this portrait in the hallway at MIT, there was this one word on the plaque that really bothered me, and it's the word predicted here, that the idea that, as we may think, was something that that predicted what would happen in the future. When I speak with people about the future and this concept of future making, people often respond by saying, well, of course, we know that the future can be changed. We have this idea. We try to intervene. We try to imagine. We try to work toward better futures. But actually, when people talk about the way that even so-called visionaries, people who were pioneering, people who were very influential, had a connection to the future, they're often spoken about as predictors of the future in this way. In fact, here's today's Wikipedia page that is about Vannevar Bush's essay, As We May Think, and you see that the Wikipedia editors also agree that it predicted the future. Although later on it says, Wikipedia is one example of how this vision has in part been realized. So at the same time, there's a contradictory impulse to describe Bush as someone who has laid out a vision, one of the impulses of which is realized by Wikipedia. It draws its inspiration from this. And then to speak of him as someone who's a predictor. So this is what I would consider the most essential knowledge about the future and the starting point for my book. And the impulse, why I wrote it, is to say that when we systematically plan for a better future, when we imagine this future, when we describe components of it that are needed for us to collaborate and work together toward it, what we're doing is not prediction. It is future making. So the idea that we actually can make a difference and that we might imagine this and share this with other people is very important. Of course, there are different ways in which we might share visions of the future. So people can write. This is the magazine in which Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, a utopian novel, was first published. An important United States utopian writing. And distributing work in writing is significant, of course. And then something I'll talk about further and show you a little video from. Douglas Engelbart's demo on a research center for augmenting human intellect gives another example of how it is people can speak or perform or demonstrate in order to give access to a particular vision of the future. And then it's also possible to exhibit the future, and that's actually from the 1964-65, the second edition of the General Motors Futurama exhibit at the World Fair in New York. This is the little pin, the lapel pin that people were given after they saw the Futurama exhibit, and I'll also speak about Futurama some. So my point is not just that people can formulate powerful ideas about the future, but they share them with each other, they present them in certain ways, and the ways in which they do this are significant. I'll now mention some about one way of slicing up the way that things are communicated and the underlying content, and that's from narrative theory, the idea that we might describe the underlying content. How will this particular future world that we imagine, how will it function, how will it work? And we can talk about separately from that the level of expression. How shall we present it to other people? How do we receive and understand it? And there's future studies work on this topic, but I'm really talking about the general interchange and communication of future visions. Not planning scenarios, but popular communication of ideas like this. I would say that the most essential knowledge from narrative theory or narratology is that it's possible to look at this story level, this underlying level at which events occur, or the underlying nature of a fictional world separately from the level of discourse or how things are expressed. So to try to get this across, I'll give a few examples of how the same underlying things can be talked about and can be expressed in different ways. And this is a very simplified view, but I'm merely mentioning this as part of a talk about the future here. There's, of course, concepts in which there's more than two of these levels, and this is only a starting point for an entire field of study in narrative theory. But let's take a look at a particular piece of comic art. This is Matt Madden. His book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, has this page in it, and it's based on Raymond Queneau's exercises in style, although the underlying story is a different one. And in this depiction of events here, we see a guy who sitting at his computer. He stands up, he goes into another room, and then from upstairs, he hears, "What time is it?" He looks at his watch and says, "It's 1:15. He hears thanks as he's opening the refrigerator. And then you see he's thinking, as he peers into the refrigerator, "What the hell was I looking for anyway?" Very, very uninteresting series of events, although perhaps not entirely separate from reality, perhaps naturalistic to some people. The thing about this is that we can tell it in a variety of different ways, and in fact, Matt Madden had told it 99 different ways in his book. So one of the things we can do that would be a classic move in narrative theory and narratology, that's understood that way, is that we can focalize a particular character and we can present what's being seen and what's being transmitted to the reader from one character's perspective, right? So here we have this first-person view on the left of the same events. Another thing that we could do is we could create additional narrative levels, or we could create distance. So instead of directly representing the events that are happening, on the right side we see the same person who is involved in these events retelling them over a cup of coffee here. Right? So these are different types of variation that we might encounter. And there's some types of variation that are specific to particular media, like when we're looking at comics, we can choose the number of frames. That would be an easy thing to look at in a comic. And on the left, there's a single frame that tries to summarize all the events that take place. You can see that the computer was recently closed. It has Z's coming out of it because it's just gone to sleep. You can see that the stacking of the speech bubbles indicates the order in which these things are said, right? And so everything is more or less conveyed in a single frame. And then while some things are added over here, we have actually a very large number of frames. We have 30 frames on the right-hand side that depict everything that's going on. And we get additional information here. We see who it is. We see a visual depiction of who it is upstairs who's asking about what time it is. And we see some interstitial events that weren't depicted earlier. So that's the starting point for what I mean by perspective when I say perspective in collective future making. And now I want to talk about a few other people who had visions of the future who were significant, starting with a utopian writer. And I want to mention this book, which is a very interesting one and very influential in the history of the United States, although it's not well known outside of Americanists in literature or people who are looking into the particular historical period. This is Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 2000, 1887. And in this novel, he had Julian West, sort of an ordinary person from the year 1887, enter a mesmeric trance and wake up in the year 2000, where he found a transformed city of Boston and found that people there had all sorts of improved living conditions, better ways to work and to distribute goods, and yet there was a connection to the way that people lived at his time, the values and the positive social aspects of 1887 were present as well. So he didn't present in this a detailed sort of solution to how to reach this year 2000, but looking backwards, did present what I'd say is a mostly plausible future, showing that there could be resources enough to meet people's needs, that they would be fairly distributed, and it looked like an American society that people would like. Let me give you a little excerpt, which I've quoted in the future, that I find is particularly compelling, and it relates to this trading card from about the same period. So in this, Julian West is gone outside, and it starts to rain, and he finds that he hasn't brought an umbrella, so he's worried about this. But no one else seems bothered by this. So, as is written in Looking Backwards, the mystery was explained when we found ourselves on the street, for a continuous waterproof covering had been let down so as to enclose the sidewalk and turn it into a well-lighted and perfectly dry corridor, which was filled with a stream of ladies and gentlemen dressed for dinner. And then one of the people in the story describes, what's happened here in the year 2000 as compared to 1887. He says, the difference between the age of individualism and that of concert was well characterized by the fact that in the 19th century, when it rained, the people of Boston put up 300,000 umbrellas over as many heads. And in the 20th century, they put up one umbrella over all the heads. So this is really describing a project of what would be called, at least in the United States, a socialist type of project. It was known as nationalism when Bellamy's book took hold. His book, after it was picked up by a second publisher and went to another printing, his book actually became approximately the best-selling book of that time. It was only Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur that outsold it, and actually over a greater period of time. So it was really a very influential book. There were literally hundreds of books written in response, more than 200. Some of them, as you might expect, agreeing and expanding upon his ideas, some of them taking issue in various ways. And so the vision was a compelling one. The next vision of the future I want to describe is presented very differently, not a book for a person to receive and hold and read individually, but a diorama for people to actually fly over. And this is the famous Futurama exhibit that was both in 1939 at the New York World's Fair and in 1964-65 in a different formulation. So these are different editions of the same Futurama exhibit. It was expanded to go underwater to the moon and various places in this later version that took place at the 64-65 World's Fair. And Norman Bell Geddes developed this exhibit for General Motors. And you can see that, well, Bell Geddes is certainly critical to the development of this exhibit. He also wrote a book, Magic Motorways, that came out after the exhibit. Most of the ways that these visions are communicated are not in a single format, a single medium. And while Bell Geddes worked on this, of course, General Motors was also a sort of corporate author of this work. The world that was envisioned in the Futurama exhibit has, to some extent, what might be called autonomous cars. So there was an idea that cars, when they're engaged in highway travel could be platooned, or that they could lock onto a rail and be taken along. It has an interstate highway system that cuts through cities, so there should be no reason that that cars should have to stop to go through, or that trucks should have to stop to go through a city any more than an airplane does. At the same time, the idea of the world and how it's presented in these in this diorama was not as an automobile-centered world. It was a world in which the city centers were really for pedestrians. It was a world of less congestion, and a world where there was flow for people to move. There's mobility, whether people were taking automobiles or whether they had an enhanced ability to walk around. I want to show you that on the left here in 1939, you can see this tremendous line for people to get into the Futurama exhibit. And so you might think it a little ironic that Bel Geddes, being so devoted to relieving congestion, created so much of it at the 1939 World's Fair. But I actually think that's relevant to the project here, because people experienced this wait in line to then be able to fly over in this exhilarating way on this moving walkway and see what this possible vision of the future would be like. All right, so the fourth and last vision of the future that I want to talk about is due to Doug Engelbart. Douglas Engelbart developed the project online system, and he had this concept of augmenting human intellect, the framework in which this project was developed. If you hear anything about Douglas Engelbart or know anything about him, you probably know that he invented the mouse. That's what he's known for, which I'll address in a little bit. But you can see that here he's having a meeting with the granting organization, the National Science Foundation here, and they're sitting around the 6 terminals for online systems and actually using them in their meeting. And here is a frame from one of the most famous technical presentations, almost certainly the most famous technical presentation, known as, thanks to Stephen Levy, as the mother of all demos. Rather than tell you about it, let me show you a little bit, like about 7 minutes of a recording from this, so that you have some idea of what he was showing this day. To an audience which was an audience of influential computer scientists and also people who were, in many cases, very, very skeptical about what Engelbart's project was. This wasn't someone who was well known and coming to them as a highly credentialed innovator, but someone who, according to Bill English, Doug Engelbart's collaborator, he said probably 80% of the people in the room thought he was a crackpot to start off with. Let's take a look at what he showed them.
I hope you'll go along with this rather unusual setting, and the fact that I remain seated when I get introduced, and the fact that I'm going to come to you mostly through this medium here for the rest of the show. And I should tell you that I'm backed up by quite a staff of people between here and Menlo Park, where Stanford Research is located, some 30 miles south of here. And if every one of us does our job well, it'll all go very interesting, I think. The research program that I'm going to describe to you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive, instantly responsive to every action you had, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute. So look what else we can do in here. I've got this file that's structured. If I want to see what's in there, I can walk down the hierarchy levels and see, or return. But there's another thing I can do. There's a route I said I have here. So here, I'm afraid I'll need a different picture of the view. So here's what I drew with a picture drawing capability here. It's a slight map. If I start from work, and here's the route I seem to have to go to pick up all the materials. And that's my plan for getting home tonight. But if I want to, I can say, the library, what am I supposed to pick up there? I can just point to that, and oh, I see, overdue books and all. Well, there was a statement there with that name on it. Go back. What am I supposed to pick up at the drugstore? I see, very interesting. All right. Market? Oh, I've already seen that. Produce and all like that. Gee, that's too much. Anyway, so we have this feature of structuring our material hierarchically, being able to move around it very well. When we get a hierarchy, such as I can show you here now, I can do things if I want to just say, I'd like to interchange produce and canned materials. Bingo. And they're all numbered rightly if I care to look. Interchanging them very quickly. Cans are going to get interchanged with produce. They do it and all gets renumbered. So I have ways of studying over, making different views, moving around, going to specified points, and modifying the structure. At the same time, I've seen that I have a repertoire of different entities, like character, knock off that character, replace the character, make that P. So I have entities of all sorts that I can say I want to do operations on, and this basic structure that I can move over and study and get about very quickly. So that is the essence now. That's the essence of the tool we have. There are a lot of details that I've left out for you. And now I'd like to stop a minute and just make sure you understand we're shifting from illustrative material to the real working stuff, in case you wouldn't recognize it otherwise. We've used this tool to do our daily work, and our system has been built, this time-sharing system, for about 6 months now. It's been working, and in that time we've gone from getting 1 console to getting about 6 working now, with 6 more due the rest of the spring. This is our 4th computer in which we've had this kind of a system, so we've learned a lot about the user features we want and how to be fairly skillful. But this next step about learning how, when you're faced with having this in your office all day, as I now do, in a very exciting sense, how do you put that to work for yourself? How do you organize your files? What kind of things do you do? So to get going on this, let's switch away from the tool we have here and talk about some of the general features of the program. All right. And it's been a goal-oriented pursuit for many years, and I think we can just go off and get a quick little picture I sketched to show this is the staffing over the years from 1950 on, and it's had slightly bumpy history. During these years, there was only one of us. I go back to where I was and say, let's continue on in this file. That link took me out to a different file, to a statement for that view, and I jump back to this file where I was, and now within this file I make a link to another to say, the HIRC is pursuing these goals. Basic goal, improve the effectiveness with which individuals and organizations work at intellectual tasks. What does their effectiveness involve then? Better solutions, faster solutions, solutions to more complex problems, with better use of human capabilities. Really thinking about that. But a corollary goal is, besides improving the effectiveness, to develop a system-oriented discipline for designing the means by which greater effectiveness is achieved. That's very important to us. The approach for this should result in the system-oriented discipline. Let me just show you how I constructed this file. You notice underneath there with that and that, there was just a link hidden here that went back to this view with a slightly different view parameters. To give you that view. All right, there's another one hidden there. It says the general approach for us, empirical. We're pursuing this monstrous goal, monstrously difficult, by building and trying empirically. And we're approaching it evolutionary-wise because we feel that it's a whole system problem. You need to get a person in that environment working in looking at the many aspects of his working system that are involved in his effectiveness. That's many more things than just these computer-aided tools. In a large system like that, we need to do it evolutionary-wise because we can't be analytic enough about it at any one point to decide what best our next thing should be. We can only decide from here, as well as we can analyze it, where we can invest our next resources to get the most return at an increase of the effectiveness of the system we have. And this item down here is the term bootstrapping applied in a slightly new sense. We're applying that to our approach, where we're saying we need a research subject group to give them these tools, put them to work with them, study them, and improve them. We'll do that by making ourselves be the subject group and studying ourselves and making the tools so that they improve our ability to develop and study these kinds of systems and to produce, in the end, this kind of system discipline. So it's a struggle doing it that way, but it's beginning to pay off.
So a pretty amazing tech demo for 1968. Development, essentially, of the same sorts of technologies that we see in the World Wide Web, not to mention like a PowerPoint-style presentation with an explanation of how these are technically implemented, as Doug Engelbart also explains the higher level motivation for doing this. And this appeared on an almost 7-meter tall screen with an early video projection. The computer that ran this was located in Menlo Park, 30 miles away from the auditorium in San Francisco where this was happening. And there was a microwave video link. Doug Engelbart, in writing his early reports, well, one of the things I'll note is that he at length quoted from Vannevar Bush's As We May Think in developing this project, but he also adopted essentially utopian style of writing in which he wrote about a fictional scientist like himself who he imagined in the future what types of augmentations of human intellect would this person have, what skills would be needed, how could the development of technology and computer systems allow the bootstrapping of the work that he was doing. And so his figure, Joe, and his utopian writing was also part of this particular project. So along these lines, one of the things I want to explain about Douglas Engelbart is that he didn't invent the mouse. Let me try to explain why not. Of course, if you do know anything about him, if you saw obituaries in 2013, you're aware that he invented the mouse. That's what people always say, and there he is with the portrait of him and the mouse. So one reason he didn't invent it is that it was invented collaboratively at Stanford Research Institute in his group, and so Bill English was one of the co-inventors, that context out of which it arose, while he certainly was the guiding force of that group, is one that should be acknowledged. But also, the system that was developed, as you see on the right, was not just a mouse. It was a mouse and then sort of ordinary keyboard that we recognize today, and then a special chording keyboard combination. So you could take your hands off the keyboard, and when you were mousing about on the right-hand side, you could use the keyboard on the left, which is capable of typing all the glyphs, but more slowly than if you use both hands to type in the middle. So at a sort of low-level hardware sort of dimension, the mouse was part of a system. It wasn't just an individual interface device. But more importantly, it was only one innovational component of a system for augmenting human intellect that Douglas Engelbart talked about. So if there wasn't anything to point at, it wouldn't have mattered that we have a mouse. And also, I think that the idea that Doug Engelbart's influence is limited to the invention of the mouse is a little bit silly. I see a lot of people who have computers open right now, and how many of you have a mouse sitting next to you? Anyone? No. Oh, one person? There's one mouse? I mean, there's also one down here. They still exist, but they're a little bit rare. So if they go away, does that mean, oh, turns out Doug Engelbart didn't have any influence after all? No, obviously, the point is that he made numerous types of innovations, and this interface device, which existed systematically within a vision of the future that we have largely arrived at, was only one component of it. So these are all things that are discussed in the book The Future, and I want to talk about something that goes a little bit beyond the discussion in here, and that is the way that we think about future perspectives, how we communicate about visions of the future, and specifically how we consider putting forth these concepts of the future, aside from what their content is. So, not strictly along lines of narrative theory, and not strictly along lines of the ways that print and personal presentation and exhibition might be set up. I've tried to look at these aspects of future visions. I have two axes. One of them is that we can present future visions that are either connected to an individual or ones that are at the extreme global. We might actually put in between there that we might have individual, family, workplace, community, national, going up to global. So that would be the vertical scale. And then the horizontal scale would be that we might have a future vision that pertains to a particular specialist, someone who's a researcher, someone who's particularly involved in a profession in academia, and involved in something that isn't general purpose or everyday, and that would be on the left-hand side. And on the right, we see how it is the everyday world. Those things that are in common for us might be changed by a future vision. So the four people that I've talked about and the particular visions of the future that I've talked about actually fall into these quadrants, such that we can look at Vannevar Bush's concept of the Memex and of hypertext that he put forth in As We May Think, as being something that is for researchers. He didn't imagine it as being for the general public. Its importance was not that a single group would have access to it and use it to work, but that it would be a very widespread network. He published about this. I think one of the things that's important is that each of these individuals, the way they put forth their vision, in some way matched with the type of vision that it was, which led to the effectiveness. Norman Bell Geddes had this everyday problem of congestion that he looked at, and the popularity of this exhibit at both World's Fairs was due to, as he put it, the fact that everyone experiences congestion. So there was always an interruption in the flow of traffic. And this made it very accessible to people. It wasn't something like conducting specialized research. It was a more shared experience that people had. And of course, he was interested in looking at this initially in a nationwide level, looking at the United States, and then in the second version of the exhibit, even going beyond the global level and showing what life would look like on the moon. In a more individuated sense, Edward Bellamy was interested in how everyday life in the year 2000 in Boston could be different, and how it specifically would have an impact on individuals and on a particular community. And so he's in that quadrant. And Douglas Engelbart showed that his research group, and they were their own subjects, and he himself, he was a main example of a person who could be transformed by this vision of the future, working as specialists, could benefit from this type of future vision and could bootstrap themselves, could enhance their ability to think, could augment their human intellect. And he is an exemplar of this lower left quadrant here. And then, to go around once more, we can see that the ways in which these ideas are presented these ways are particularly sensible for the specialization to the individual or to broader society, to research orientation, or to common everyday life. So Vannevar Bush wrote an article in a U.S. magazine that was read by intellectuals, and it was to some extent a popular magazine, but it was where people would engage with ideas in different ways, which is why Douglas Engelbart, of course, found it later on. Douglas Engelbart making this presentation to a specialized group, really inventing the form of the tech demo in order to do this. Was able to show how the technology worked, but also to put the focus on himself and acknowledging his collaborators, thanking them, being very open and generous to them, but also showing that he, as an example of someone who did use this technology and would be the type of person who would benefit from it in the future, was there presenting in front of everyone. Edward Bellamy's perspective is quite a contrast to Norman Belgetti's. He takes the view of this particular outsider to society, someone who showed up more than 100 years in the future, and has to have everything explained to him. And sees what the effect is on an individual level, whereas Belgetti's has viewers move through on this moving walkway, moving seats, to observe from above this diorama that explains how it is that society can be transformed in this high level. So, some of the points that I tried to get across here, that a vision of the future is both content, there's some idea of what the future can be like, and it's an expression. There's some way in which it's communicated. Also, that the content, the story level in the narrative theory sense, and the expression, the discourse level in that sense, they influence each other. So the reason that visions of the future are successful has to do with compatibility, with a match between what that vision is, if it's specialized, if it's common, if it's something that is a high level and survey of what could happen at a national or global level, or if it's specific to an individual impact. These relate to what is an effective presentation of it, and the presentation of it would then provoke more thinking and more conversation about the underlying content. And then, of course, the basic idea that is behind all of this is that systematic vision isn't just a prediction, it is future making. So you can invent the mouse, that's very nice, and then that gives you something to hold when someone's taking your picture. But the real influence comes from developing the systematic framework. The mouse is really just like an instance of metonymy. It's like when you say the crown issued a decree. Obviously, the crown is not issuing the decree. It's the monarch. The White House itself is not putting forth a policy. It's the person in the White House, right? So the mouse is just a focal point, just a figurative item here for the future making that's being done by this broader framework. So that's what I had to offer, and I hope that there's some interest and some questions. I'll be glad to continue the discussion. Thanks very much. I do feel this headset makes me feel very Engelbartian, with my mouse over here. and with this, this apparatus, but.
And we use that because we are taping this, and obviously we're going to put it online afterwards. Thank you, Nick. I want to start by inviting Alicia Smeerberg up here in front. Alicia is a PhD student in interaction design, and not only has she been listening closely to the talk, she's also been reading the book The Future. So Alicia will be the first one to start a discussion with you, and then we'll open the floor for everyone else. Right. So please, Alicia, if you'll take this.
Can I take that? Okay. I don't usually use a mic, so I'm hoping this is okay. Thank you for the talk. It was lovely, and I really enjoyed reading your book. One thing that struck me is that you keep going in and out of technology and fiction and talking about these things sort of on and off. And I was reminded a little bit about, in Star Trek, where in the original series, there is only one black woman a part of the crew, and she is the telephone operator. And I find that really fascinating because Star Trek, especially the original series, said to have this amazing ability to imagine new things, completely new ways of doing things, but they still carry on sort of old school prejudice, racism, sexism into the old system. Could you talk about that a little bit? Like, how do we prevent ourselves from carrying on old prejudice into a new future, in a sense?
Yeah, and I have to, one of the things I'd mention is that the people who I talk about, the particular visionaries that I discussed today, are all from the United States, and they're all white men. Norman Bel Geddes collaborated with his wife, and not quite to the extent that Charles and Ray Eames did together, but they were, U.S. designers that did work in I think, a different and somewhat more liberated way than previously had been done. But my point in discussing these is that they are the touchstones for future visions, and there's things like, for instance, people's ability to be future makers rather than future predictors that they give these examples of. So I wanted to show this in some of the well-known cases. The other thing is to look at historical context. So in fact, when I was mentioning Bel Geddes and the Eameses. Bel Geddes also took his wife's, Bell is his wife's name, so they took compound last names. And so people had ideas that might be historically a little bit more advanced, even if we look back at them and we find that they're constrained by stereotype or constrained by prejudice. Star Trek had a reasonably, more than reasonably sort of racially diverse cast and a utopian outlook, I think, for the time period in which it came about. Uhura is in command of the Enterprise and the animated series, by the way. Have you seen that episode?
Yeah, I have seen it. And she's fantastic. I don't mean to diminish her by any means.
I know. So I think that these issues are ones, I can tell from the number of flags that you have in the side of my book there, that you probably noticed my reference to to Vannevar Bush is, as we may think, that a lot of his discussion is, well, frankly, sexist. He describes the languid fingers of the girls who are typing, who will provide the data that's needed for, presumably the male scientist to be looking and doing the research that's important, right? His discussion of stenography and of this is also something, and speech recognition. So speech recognition systems developed in military contexts have had bias toward male voices, and for a long time, people through the 60s at least, there were people who thought that to use computers, it would be unnecessary really to learn to type. That was something that women did, and there was no way we were going to train, executives and generals and these important men to type on a computer. And so these are things that when that do have these long-lasting sorts of implications. And there's inertia that has to be dealt with, definitely.
And I think you also say in one of the little flags in my book, you also say that some of these women who learned to type, they became armed sort of by technology going into the future in a sense, which I think is really nice. And that kind of quite nicely leads me on to my second question, because I think that today we live in a world that is connected, that is sort of enabling people to collaborate and to do things, to connect with new ideas and to do so globally, but also locally. How can we ensure that the future that we're going into is democratically or collaboratively made? I know that's a huge question, but I would like to hear your point of view on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it really goes back to the very, very fundamental, essential item in the book of acknowledging that future making is possible rather than just prediction. And this is something that this book isn't written for people who want to go into future studies or who want to do futurology, things like this. It's written for activists, artists, entrepreneurs, for people who are looking to collaborate to determine things, or not determine perhaps, but to influence things about the future, to offer better imagination and better possibilities by working together. So to start with, I think that having that idea is a powerful one. My own perspective on collaboration is that it's good to look for opportunities for that. One of the things that we're afforded by networking technologies. I mean, Doug Engelbart was actually showing in his demo. He was showing how hierarchies are implemented, and how you can look at it in an outline list and how you can move it around and manipulate it. But there's also non-hierarchical elements like the journey home on a graph, going around the city. And so finding that there are possibilities for a non-hierarchical collaboration as well as a more stereotypical, top-down, controlled sorts of collaboration is also, I think, very valuable. And just to make reference to one of the projects, Tin Print, this book that was done by 10 of us. I organized this project, but it's not written by me any more than it is the other 9 authors. It is a project that was done by a distributed group of people of different age and experience and background. And and the only we didn't apply for grants. We didn't sort of get permission from an external authority. Actually, the only support we had was from Doug Seri right there, who is the editor who championed the project at MIT Press, and that allowed it to go forward and for us to do this and have it published as a book. So, looking for opportunities. It's necessary in many contexts to seek that grant funding and to have hierarchical sorts of organization. It's necessary to get through university studies, to go through hierarchical stages and so forth. But looking for the alternatives and options that are different is very valuable as well, not just in an academic context, but in many different contexts.
Are we doing for time? Do I have time for one more? Okay.
Okay.
Isn't there a risk that if these people who are the collaborators are the ones collaborating to make the future. Like, for example, if we predict the future or make the future, and we do that thinking about technology, and we think about technology and we make technology, isn't that the risk that we make the future for technology, not for people? In a similar way that if academics collaborate to make the future, isn't it the risk that the future becomes for academics and not for everyone else?
I think that risk is present, and that's why I think a project that also relates to my identification of Douglas Engelbart as someone who developed the project of augmenting human intellect, which is a project that involves computers, rather than saying he's the inventor of the mouse, which is a particular technical intervention. So I think that we do need to keep in mind, that this is something also that Norman Bell Geddes, was addressing. That the way he talked about it was decreasing congestion. You could also say increasing mobility, right? That's a sort of value, that people being able to get around is what's valuable, not particularly the velocity of automobiles going through a city, or not the sort of technological sort of idea. So yeah, I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Some people need to be starting from the bottom up and trying to improve and develop the technologies that we have. Some people need to be developing the next generation of technologies. Some people need to be innovating technologically in different ways, but it's also important to have thinking that isn't always technologically grounded. And I think the most effective future visionaries, whether it's these particular four or others, did have in mind these high-level concepts.
Do I get one more? Yes, I do. Okay. I thought it was really nice as well to see design fiction mentioned in a book. It's I find that quite rare to see that in a book that's not written by people who say that they do design fiction, which makes me wonder, do you work with design fiction? Is that what this is, or is this something else?
Oh, well, let me mention where to put. So one of the things I discuss in the book is the famous, A Day Made of Glass. This is a Corning video, and so just to say where it goes here on the chart, so it's definitely in the everyday sort of category. Of course, it's not projected as far into the future as Edward Bellamy was doing, and it's also not as individualized. It's focused on a family that is doing different activities, but one of the significant differences is that it's people who inhabit that future to begin with, and Bellamy's view is focalized on someone who is an outsider to the future, who comes in and needs it explained, right? So here you see the digital native. You see people who are part of that. So I consider myself an artist, literary artist in the work that I do, rather than a designer. And so, I'm more interested in concepts of how different types of literary art, particularly those involving computation, can interact with the future in different ways, can provoke ideas about the future. So as I discuss in the book, I'm not some people think that we could take a poll. Some people think that design and art are the same thing. I don't know if no one thinks that here? No, we don't have that idea. I mean, John Maeda, and might, and won't speak for him. Paul Rand probably did, I think. There's some people who did think this. Charles Eames did not think this. And so, the problem-solving impulse of design is something that can be effective in future making, but also the less constrained provocation and intervention of art is something that has a part to play, I think, also.
Combination of the two, maybe. A
yes.
combination of the two.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand it back to you here.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.
You're welcome to come back again with more questions if you want to, but open for everybody else here in the auditorium who wants to have a comment or question. And I use the mic so we can get it on tape as well.
Hi, thanks for an interesting talk. I had a question a little bit about a lot of these people were funded by industry and other large government organizations. And certainly, I don't know that much about Edward Bellamy, but only 50 years later, Brave New World was written. So kind of what is the role in that type of future making where you have, a long history of government and military support for imagining the future, and how does that play into the future? Especially if you contrast it with Ted Nelson as well, sort of kind of as an outliner.
Well, I can tell you, it's one of the fascinating things about having the first time I did a reading from this book was at the MIT Press bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the books just arrived there at the bookstore that day, and I hadn't seen a physical copy of the book when I showed up for the reading, but they were there in time, and so I met someone who. He said, "Oh yes, I came in earlier, and I saw that this book was there, and so I got it and I read it, and I came back for your reading." So this is actually the first person to have read the physical copy of the book, I think, and he's an executive at GM, it definitely, General Motors has a large footprint in this book and looking at this, and there is a strong dimension of government and corporate influence. In part, that is because when you have well-established corporations who are very good at what they do, they have money to invest in attempting to figure out what the next steps will be. And, you find places like Xerox PARC, which picked up the work of Doug Engelbart, and then Apple and Microsoft, projecting that into personal computing. Are ways of continuing projects that essentially began as government funded. So it's seldom the case that everything is done in one sector in the United States, I think. From my standpoint, I wasn't trying to influence with this particular book executives at major corporations or government leaders as much as people who are trying to offer various types of interventions and collaborations that are different from what future making has been established, but also to pull out lessons like what's positive from the things that people have done in those contexts. Because I think that even though Vannevar Bush is highly implicated in the military-industrial complex, or what might even better be called the military-industrial academic complex in the United States, he certainly did a lot of good by formulating this particular type of vision that was expressed in this essay. The people who are not government funded and who are not driven by corporate investment are not always a lot better. So I have a chapter on the futurists, the Italian futurists, who are extraordinarily problematic politically and contributed to the fascist rise in Italy, and their perspective was deeply flawed in a lot of ways. And yet I think that in all of these cases, people who are future-oriented in these different contexts, there are things you can pull out that are lessons that mean something to the practice of future making.
Thank you for a very nice talk. Per-Anders Sirgren, Malmö University. It seems like it's an increased interest in the future at the moment, and I wonder if you have some reflections on that. And also, although we see this interest, also the act of future making, as you describe it, that it's actually possible for everyone, not only some huge corporation, seems also difficult to grasp for a lot of people. Do you have some reflections on that?
So, I mean, I think that in certain ways there is interest in the future, but I think that there's also, when people are explicitly asked about this issue, the idea that you can make the future is obvious to them, but the way that they actually speak about this in conversation, the language they employ, what's underneath that, turns out to be a more passive idea. So part of the interest in the future, of course, has to do with increasing awareness of catastrophic global climate change and a need to react to that, and that's something that there are times when you want to be predictive and you want to be responsive. You want to start from a particular eventuality. You want to start from something that is ongoing, just like. You want to, if it's predicted that it's going to rain, since we haven't adopted Edward Bellamy's solution to that, you want to take your umbrella with you, right? So that's part of the interest in the future, but it's also something that's driven in a lot of ways by fear, and how to create an urban environment that is not just something that is lower energy, is sustainable, is involved with a reaction to these issues, a very necessary reaction, but also is something that proactively considers the possibilities of how people could live together, how people could have augmented human intellect or better social and cultural connection. Right? That's significant as well. You had a second question, which...
I think you answered too. I mean, it's also the act of future making. For some people, especially people with power, it might be a way to think that it's something that's manageable, that you could, through careful planning, really do stuff. But I mean, as I understand you, it's more like everyday people can be engaged in future making. Well,
I mean, some people are much more powerful and wealthier than other people, and they have more influence over what happens in the world. There's really nothing to doubt about this, but they don't have the time to imagine every possibility. They don't have the ability to engage with all of the ways that we might systematically conceive of futures, and so I think there's something for all sorts of people to do in participating in this. I mean, and this applies of these folks. I mean, for example, Douglas Engelbart was a radio technician. He was someone who started this project, and you can, and as he put it, for these many years there was only one of us, working on it, right? So he wasn't someone who was particularly bankrolling this with, starting from a standpoint of being very powerful and wealthy. So I think people are able to make contributions in different ways, and to have their ideas shared with others, and to have those ideas become part of the future and part of the present that we live in. another person who's discussed in the book, Alan Kay, who, well, this is, if we're going to point to specific things, this is Doug Engelbart's, and this is Alan Kay's right here. He formulated with collaborators the idea of the of the notebook computer and the Dynabook project. And Alan Kay was sitting in the audience at the Mother of all demos, watching what Doug Engelbart was up to, and was extraordinarily impressed, as apparently everyone was. So these connections are made historically. And there's evidence that people who are dedicated to future making and who are open to collaboration in developing these ideas and frameworks, as Engelbart and Kay both were, do make a difference. Now, Bellamy was someone who, you can look at his project and say, well, he is sort of the lone author writing this novel off by himself, but as a result of this novel, what he did was to provoke book clubs forming across the United States, and people having discussions about what was then called nationalism, essentially socialism, and to provoke a huge number of responses, and even utopian communities in some cases. So he maybe didn't do all the collaboration beforehand, but he prompted a lot of people to think together about these issues.
I mean, yeah, today we have an enormous amount of sci-fi and stuff in different forms. Still, I get the sense that Bellamy's piece had much more influence in some ways, or what would you say about that? I mean, compared today? Do we have something similar today, some artwork that have influenced people in the same way as Bellamy's?
Sure. I mean, so one of the things is that I think science fiction particularly tends to be science fiction is generally about the present. I mean, it's set in the future in many cases, not always, but it really is about contemporary political situations. So I used to, he's retired now, but one of my colleagues, one of my former colleagues at MIT, Joe Haldeman, wrote a wonderful book, The Forever War, about people going at relativistic speeds out, to fight as infantry, coming back at relativistic speeds, finding out that, everyone at home has forgotten them. And, Joe's a Vietnam War veteran. And I mean, he's writing the science fiction that's about the particular political situation that he himself was engaged in, and this is often the case with science fiction. So I mean, not every bit of science fiction is doing the utopian work that we might expect, but it might be doing other good and important social and cultural sorts of work. And I also think that there's the lure of the dystopian, which is utopias include the e-utopia, the good nowheres, and also the dystopias, the bad nowheres, and it's often more gripping. It's more spectacular to see what those bad nowheres look like, and they can be provocative and relevant and important also. But there's room for Star Trek and other, other sorts of things.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for a great talk. So I have a question that's somewhat associative, I think. I keep looking at your computer, same as it ever was, and I'm gonna, I'm gonna assume that that's the Talking Heads lyric, right? So how did we get here is a line from that lyric that I really am reminded of. And I'm
David Byrne just has an album out.
Oh,
American Utopia.
See, there you go.
Anyway.
No, so I'm thinking of other MIT press authors, by the way, Wendy Chun and others, who are talking about what happens when these technologies that we surround ourselves become habitual and maybe invisible in various ways that are detrimental to our, I would say, attention to exactly the kinds of questions that you're talking about. Because a lot of this, just at a basic level, demands that we sit down and spend time and focus and think about this. And it seems like we are surrounding ourselves today with technology that is making all their effort to make sure that we are not paying attention or are just kind of habitually going through things.
But wait, so is it the invisibility of the technology, or is it
I'm not sure. I have it's a bit confused maybe this question, but it's something about it's there, and obviously we see it. But it becomes habitual, even maybe not invisible, right? But ubiquitous. I'm getting a little bit of help. Maybe we can talk it. Not really ubiquitous computing, but I'm
constantly annoying computing.
Yeah, exactly. The question is basically more about attention and concentration.
Yeah.
What does it take to do what these white men were doing, and can we do that today?
Well, I think that there are issues with there are ways in which abstracting away from the particularities of technology and not focusing on questions of specific technological implementation, can allow us to think about higher level issues of importance in better ways. So, I mean, even Doug Engelbart, who was working to develop this extraordinary networked software system that, by the way, supported video conferencing, and as well as this hypertext and hierarchical outlining and graph drawing and all of this, he didn't build the hardware of the computers that he was using, right? I mean, so the time-sharing systems, came. I mean, there was a division between the electrical engineering work and the way he was putting together that system. So I think that there are people who should overlap these abstraction boundaries, but it's reasonable to have these for different types of work to go forward and for different types of future building to go forward. And you can put forth an idea of the future based on your understanding of certain levels of abstraction, and then people can respond if they have other ideas that question what you've come up with. The issue of, this issue of attention is something, that's one thing that Vannevar Bush, I think, didn't predict. He didn't imagine that, the scholar looking at the history of the bow and arrow, who he talks about, and as we may think, would be checking his Twitter feed constantly, or otherwise engaged with the continual distractions of computing. So I don't know how those sorts of issues, I don't know whether they're core intellectual issues, or whether the scholar of the bow and arrow would be going to make a cup of coffee or or otherwise, like finding opportunities for interruption. But I think that. There are issues as to the duration of projects. So being able to, having NLS that is able to be carried forward across different time-sharing systems, across different computing platforms, that's something that remains very challenging. If you're working on something and the platform itself is not stable, this is something that happens in electronic literature. People are they start and work in Mtropolis, and then they change to Macromedia Director, and then they're working in Flash, and then they're like, oh no, I need to move on to HTML5, and so and so there's a variety of possibilities for getting distracted and tripped up, but that's part of the landscape of possibility, I think, for developing future concepts.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I have one question I'm thinking about when reading the book is that you make a point of that in order to make futures, you really have to be systematic. You have to know what to look for to do something. Otherwise, you may not wind up anywhere. On the other hand, you can take someone like the author Nicholas Taleb in his book The Black Swan, arguing about how basically all important things, world happenings, inventions, are random. It's very difficult to actually predict, but even construct or make something in that sense. So the question is, how do you deal with that idea? I mean, how do you actually, would this help us? Are there some places here where it's easier to make futures than others? Or how do you deal with the idea that so much things are actually very difficult to predict or to create?
Well, I think there's certain types of development that you look at and you say, well, how is calculus a random development? I mean, it was developed independently at the same time by Newton and Leibniz, right? So, I mean, it seems to be evidence that these things that are developed in different parts of the world contemporaneously or not contemporaneously, that it's hard to think about these as pure random events, or if they're random, they're occurring with a high enough probability that they're happening. So the World Wide Web doesn't seem very random when we start to look at work of people like Douglas Engelbart and writings of people like Ted Nelson, things like this. I think that that may be something that's applicable to a reactive view, but if we're trying to think about the ways that we can contribute to issues of urban life, social and cultural connection, information exchange, what the possibilities are for the involvement of computing in the enhancement of people's intellectual capabilities and their abilities to research and continue to build the great record, as Vannevar Bush called it. These issues, I think, aren't quite as sensitive to these particular inflectional points of historical moments. I think I don't mean to describe, the World Wide Web as an inevitable outcome for which, we shouldn't acknowledge the work of Tim Berners-Lee. I think obviously it's important that that project was accomplished. Its success, I think, is in large part due to someone who's willing to put together a simple system that was offered freely to the world, rather than trying to build something very elaborate and centralized. But you can see that that wasn't a concept that came out of nowhere. It's connected to these historical developments.
Any more questions? Yep.
It connects, I think, to the previous question around randomness, in the sense that, of course, now when we look at these future makers, we of course have the clarity of the present to look back and kind of evaluate the what came true and what didn't. And how much do you think this is shaping the way in which we look at these people as visionaries, right? But how many other future makers have been around that made just predictions that we can't really relate to? Like, how much is this us making kind of picking out stuff based on the present?
So came true, which is the phrase that you used, is a predictive phrase, not a future-making phrase. So that's one thing I want to say. We're talking, but the other thing is that, of course, you look to, if I'm trying, as I do in this book, if I'm trying to draw the lessons, if I'm trying to say what practices in future making have been effective, what can we learn from, then in that case, it makes sense to look at the people who successfully made the future, not the people who failed at making the future, right? So that's the justification for the focus on this. It's true that other people, developed concepts, systematic concepts, perhaps in some cases that weren't realized or haven't yet been realized. But to try to see why these things worked, I think it does make sense to look at, to start off with, these well-acknowledged successes. And then part of the issue here, which, I mean, even though this chart here is not in the book, I do lay out that the way in which a vision of the future is expressed, is importantly related to what that vision of the future is, right? So that's something we would take up, and then as we're trying to be future makers, as we're trying to intervene in this process, right, we want to be aware that we probably shouldn't expect to be able to uniformly present our report of every possible concept that we develop. So in some cases, we want to think about the way it would influence an individual, in some cases a city. In some cases, we would look at how a very specialized case of a researcher might be affected. In other cases, we're talking about everyday life, right? So I think it's suitable, even though there are many unsuccessful cases of future building, I think it's suitable to look at the successful cases when you're trying to draw lessons from them.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Before we finish here, I just want to say we do these media talks basically once a month. There's actually going to be a MIT Press author coming again in April, David A. Nye, who's professor in University of Southern Denmark, and he's going to talk about why technology matters, or technology matters altogether. So you're very welcome to that. We're going to announce that soon on the our webpage. But thank you very much for giving this great talk and the discussion, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.